speak of shame, I am not speaking merely of that natural pang which arises when one has violated conscience, but of a more insidious presence, one that attaches itself like a shadow which is not your own. Many of you carry shame that never belonged to you, shame inherited from parents, teachers, cultures, even entire epochs of history. It clings to the psyche as though it were self-generated, yet, when examined, it reveals itself as borrowed, implanted, even imposed. The psyche is like a house with many chambers, and when you walk through its dimly lit corridors, you may find certain rooms cluttered with objects that are not yours. They are heirlooms of ancestral pain, relics of forgotten prohibitions, and whispers of collective judgments that have seeped into your personal identity. To live under borrowed shame is to live under a false weight. It bends the spine, it suppresses the voice, it dims the fire of the soul. And yet, because shame so often conceals itself beneath the mask of morality, duty, or even love, one seldom questions its origin. One feels unworthy, unclean, or guilty without truly knowing why. This is the first sign that the shame is not yours. It lacks a clear origin in your authentic actions. Instead, it arises like a phantom, appearing from the unconscious and demanding your silence. Consider the dreams in which you find yourself naked in public, exposed before a crowd that stares with condemnation. This dream, universal in its imagery, is not merely a commentary on one's fear of exposure. It is the psyche dramatizing the condition of borrowed shame. You are unclothed, not because you sinned, but because your vulnerability has been invaded by the eyes of the collective. The archetype of the crowd, of the judging multitude, has taken up residence in your inner world, and its gaze becomes unbearable. And yet, the nakedness in such dreams is often innocent. There is nothing obscene in your state of being. The obscenity lies in the gaze that condemns, in the projection of others' discomfort with their own bodies, their own desires, their own fears. What we borrow unconsciously, we often confuse with what is essentially our own. This is the dangerous power of the collective unconscious. Within it lie archetypes of purity and impurity, of sin and redemption, of honor and disgrace. When these archetypes constellate in the psyche, they often cloak themselves in the garments of personal experience. One thinks, I am ashamed, when in truth one is merely hosting the ancient voice of humanity's unresolved conflicts. The shame belongs not to the individual, but to the lineage, to the culture, to the tribe that could not face its own shadow. The shadow, that dark twin of consciousness, is never content to remain hidden. What is repressed in one generation seeks expression in the next. Thus, children inherit not only the physical traits of their parents, but also their psychic burdens. The mother who was shamed for her desires will raise a daughter who feels guilty for hungers she has not yet named. The father who was humiliated for his failures will raise a son who trembles at the thought of disappointing others, even when he has done nothing wrong. These psychic debts are passed down invisibly like an inheritance. No one asked for, yet everyone receives. This is the tragedy of borrowed shame. It is bequeathed without consent and carried without question, but let us not remain in tragedy alone. For recognition itself is already a movement toward freedom. To recognize that shame is borrowed is to loosen its grip. Imagine yourself holding a heavy sack, believing it to be filled with treasures you must guard. At last, you open it and discover it is filled with stones collected by others. They are not yours. They were placed in your hands long before you could object. The act of recognition allows you to put the sack down, to return the stones to the riverbed of history where they belong. Yet the psyche resists letting go, because even borrowed shame gives the illusion of belonging. If I carry this burden, the unconscious says, then I am connected to those before me. Their suffering becomes my identity. Their chains are my link to them. Thus, there is a perverse loyalty to shame, a loyalty that must be broken if one is to individuate. Individuation is not merely the discovery of the self, but the courageous return of all that was never truly yours. The psyche must give back to the collective what the collective has imposed, so that the individual may stand free in the nakedness of truth. I've often said that the unconscious will present itself in images, and indeed, the act of returning borrowed shame is frequently symbolized in dreams. A patient once dreamed she was in a vast marketplace, burdened with baskets filled with rotten fruit. She wandered from stall to stall, offering the fruit, but no one would take it. Finally, an old woman approached and said, "Child, this fruit is not yours to sell. It belongs to the earth." The dreamer then laid the baskets upon the soil, and the earth opened to swallow them. Upon waking, she wept with relief. The image had shown her that she had been carrying shame, not her own, shame that could be returned to the greater unconscious shame, when it is authentic, has the power to purify. It is the soul's alarm bell, signaling that one has betrayed one's inner law. But borrowed shame is poison. It keeps the soul in a state of perpetual apology, of quiet suffocation, and because it is not authentic, it cannot be resolved by confession, penance, or restitution. No ritual of atonement can absolve you from what was never your sin. You cannot wash away the stain of another's projection. You can only refuse to carry it. And yet, I must warn you, to lay down borrowed shame is not without peril. The collective resents those who refuse its burdens. The tribe is unsettled when one of its members steps out of the circle of guilt and declares, "This is not mine." Such a one is often accused of arrogance, selfishness, even blasphemy. The world prefers those who carry its unconscious weight without protest. Thus, the path of individuation is always lonely, always marked by conflict. To return borrowed shame is to risk exile, but it is a holy exile, the necessary solitude in which the self can emerge. We must understand also the intimate link between shame and projection. What the individual or society cannot bear within themselves, they cast upon another. This projection becomes the borrowed shame of the victim. Consider the scapegoat ritual of ancient cultures. The community places its sins upon the goat and drives it into the wilderness. The goat bears what was never his, carrying shame, not his own. The scapegoat is the living symbol of borrowed shame, expelled for the sake of the collective's fragile conscience. Today, we do not drive goats into the desert, but we scapegoat individuals, families, even entière nations. We cover them with our projections, and they, in turn, carry the weight of our unacknowledged darkness. To awaken to this dynamic is to awaken to the profound injustice that underlies much of human suffering. The alcoholic son is shamed for his weakness, while the family ignores the ancestral wounds that drive his despair. The sensitive child is mocked for her tears, while the society suppresses its own grief and cannot bear to see it mirrored. The woman accused of seduction bears the shame of men who have never reconciled with their own desires. In each case, the shame does not belong to the one who carries it. It is borrowed, projected, imposed, and yet it lives within them as though it were native. To heal, one must discern the voice of authentic conscience from the voice of borrowed condemnation. Authentic conscience speaks with clarity. You have harmed, you must amend. Borrowed condemnation whispers endlessly, without reason, without context. You are wrong, you are bad, you are unworthy. The former invites transformation. The latter demands paralysis. The former is a sacred guide. The latter, a parasitic intruder. The work of analysis is often nothing more than teaching the psyche to distinguish between these two voices and to return the latter to the void from which it came. Even now, as you listen, you may feel within yourself the stirrings of such borrowed shame. Perhaps your body tenses, your heart beats faster, as though expecting judgment. Perhaps you recall moments of humiliation that still burn in memory. Though no crime was committed, these are signs that the borrowed voice is near, and I tell you, it is time to give it back, not in bitterness, not in vengeance, but in the quiet dignity of one who has recognized the truth. When we penetrate more deeply into the structure of shame, we find that it does not operate merely as an emotion, but as an archetypal force. Shame is tied to the primordial experience of exposure. In Edenic myth, Adam and Eve did not first feel fear when they ate of the forbidden fruit. They felt shame at their nakedness. Before any punishment was enacted, shame arose, wrapping them in the garment of concealment. Thus, shame is bound to the archetype of the fall. The movement from unconscious innocence into self-conscious separation, to this day, shame bears within it the residue of that mythic rupture, an echo of humanity's first awareness of itself under the gaze of a greater other. But when we borrow shame, we borrow not only the emotion but the entire mythic pattern. We enact in our psyches the fall of someone else. We live the exile of another sin. Imagine being born into a family that carries a hidden disgrace, a betrayal, a scandal, an unspoken crime, and growing up under its shadow. Even if you know nothing of the details, you may feel exiled from the beginning, as though already condemned. This is the myth of borrowed shame, to live in someone else's expulsion from paradise. Let us pause here to consider the role of dreams once again. Dreams are the royal road not only to the unconscious but also to the archetypal theater where shame performs its secret dramas. One dream I encountered involved a young man standing in a church without clothing, surrounded by robed figures pointing accusingly. Yet, when he looked down at himself, he realized there was no blemish, no mark of sin upon his body. The dream, in its symbolic clarity, revealed that the shame he carried had no basis in his own life. The robed figures were the ancestors, the guardians of old prohibitions, projecting upon him the guilt they could not integrate. Here we see how the dream exposes the masquerade. The shame was never his. Borrowed shame thrives in silence. It requires secrecy to maintain its illusion of belonging. Children sense it in the nervous glances between parents, in the stories left unfinished, in the prohibition against asking certain questions. Silence becomes a wall, and behind that wall festers the unspoken weight. But the psyche knows the unconscious is a faithful recorder of what is disowned. It delivers fragments through symptoms, compulsions, and anxieties. What cannot be spoken is still enacted. The child who grows up under borrowed shame may find herself over-apologizing, hiding her talents, or sabotaging her own success. She does so not because she is guilty, but because she has unconsciously pledged loyalty to the ancestral silence. The body, too, becomes the vessel of what is borrowed. Observe the blush that rises to the cheeks without cause, the hunched posture of one who tries to make herself invisible, the nervous stomach that churns in social encounters. The body remembers the shame that was never integrated, and it manifests as somatic ritual. These are not merely psychosomatic quirks. They are the body's testimony to the borrowed weight of history. Yet I must stress that the work of individuation does not mean rejecting one's ancestors or denying the collective altogether. It means discerning what belongs and what does not. To individuate is to inherit consciously. It is to take what is truly yours, the patterns, wounds, and gifts that shape your unique path, and to relinquish what belongs to another's unfinished business. In this way, individuation is an act of justice. It restores to each what is theirs, and it frees the self to shine without distortion. Let me speak now of the archetype of the scapegoat in more detail, for it is here that the mechanism of borrowed shame becomes most visible. In many cultures, the scapegoat bore the sins of the people and was cast out into the wilderness. This ritual dramatized the human need to project unbearable guilt onto another. But when we look psychologically, we see that the scapegoat lives within us as well. The scapegoat is that part of the psyche that carries all the disowned elements, all the unloved fragments. When we borrow shame, we allow our inner scapegoat to be burdened not only with our own shadow, but also with the shadow of others. The soul becomes doubly exiled, banished, not only from society, but from itself. How then do we return what was never ours? It is not enough to say, "This shame is not mine," for words alone do not dissolve the psychic imprint. The return must be enacted symbolically. Analysis provides one form of ritual: to speak aloud the hidden burdens, to name them in the presence of another, is already to transfer them from the personal unconscious back into the collective field. Rituals of release, whether through dreams, creative expression, or even conscious visualization, can also serve this purpose. One might imagine placing the borrowed shame into a vessel and offering it to the fire, the river, the wind. The psyche responds to symbols, not merely to logic. Thus, the act of returning must be both conscious and symbolic. I recall a woman who carried a profound sense of impurity. Though she had lived an upright life, in analysis, we uncovered that her grandmother had been ostracized by the village for an illicit affair, and that silence had wrapped around the family ever since. The shame had leapt across generations, attaching itself to the granddaughter like an invisible curse. When she finally recognized this, she performed a ritual. She wrote her grandmother's name on a stone and placed it on the grave, whispering, "This is yours, not mine." From that day, her posture changed. She walked taller, her eyes lifted. She had returned the shame to its rightful owner, not in judgment, but in truth. And yet, we must also ask, what is the gift hidden in borrowed shame? For even in distortion, the psyche preserves meaning. Those who carry what is not theirs often develop a deep empathy, a sensitivity to the unspoken suffering of others. They become healers, artists, visionaries, precisely because they have borne invisible weights. The danger, of course, is that they mistake the borrowed burden for their identity and never step into their own freedom. But if they can return what is not theirs, while retaining the sensitivity it cultivated, then the borrowed shame becomes the seed of wisdom. This paradox is crucial. The psyche does not waste anything, not even error. The borrowed shame that once bound you can, when relinquished, become the soil in which your compassion grows. You will know the taste of exile, and thus you will welcome the outcast. You will know the silence of hidden burdens, and thus you will give voice to the voiceless. You will know the false weight of projections, and thus you will help others discern what is truly theirs. But you cannot remain in bondage in order to be compassionate. You cannot serve the world by remaining enslaved to a lie. The world needs individuals who have walked through the fire of false shame and emerged whole. Such individuals radiate authenticity. They are no longer paralyzed by the gaze of others, nor do they seek to hide in the safety of collective approval. They stand as mirrors, reminding others that the soul's worth is not defined by the borrowed judgments of history. Therefore, I say to you, if you feel the chains of shame tightening around you, pause and ask, whose voice is this? From where does this weight come? Does it arise from my authentic actions, or is it an echo of someone else's fear, someone else's unresolved shadow? And if it is borrowed, dare to return it. Return it to the collective, to the ancestors, to the earth itself. Stand once again in your own skin, unashamed, for it was never yours to carry. The exile of shame is not only personal but collective. Entire cultures carry burdens that are never examined, projecting their unresolved shadows onto outsiders. History is full of such expulsions. Minorities blamed for calamities, witches burned for the unconscious fears of their villages, strangers condemned because the tribe could not face its own contradictions. These spectacles of projection are not relics of the past. They live within us still. Each time a society scapegoats a group, each time a rumor destroys a reputation, the same ancient pattern repeats. Shame is borrowed by the victim and borne until someone dares to give it back. When shame is collective, the individual often suffers in silence, believing the burden to be a private curse. But this is not so. It is a web woven across generations, an atmosphere saturated with unspoken guilt. I have seen this in the children of war, who inherit the silence of atrocities they did not commit. I have seen it in those who belong to cultures demonized by history, carrying a stigma they never chose. And I have seen it in the families where secrets pass like invisible heirlooms. In all these cases, shame functions as a psychic exile, pushing the bearer outside the circle of belonging. They become strangers not because of who they are, but because of what they carry. The archetype of exile has many faces. It is the wanderer, the orphan, the pilgrim, but beneath them all lies the same truth. To be exiled is to bear shame that isolates, whether deserved or borrowed. And yet, in the paradoxical way of archetypes, exile can also become initiation. For when one can endure being cast out, when one can survive the loneliness of carrying what was never theirs, one discovers a freedom unknown to those still bound by collective illusions. Exile strips away false belonging and leaves only the raw encounter with the self. Let us enter this more deeply, for the exile archetype carries both wound and gift. When the soul is forced out of the tribe's protective circle, it feels naked, abandoned, defenseless. But in that very nakedness lies the chance to encounter what is eternal, alone, stripped of borrowed identities. The individual stands face to face with the self, that inner image of wholeness which no tribe, nor projection, no shame can touch. Many mystics were outcasts, driven into deserts or cloisters by the collective suspicion, yet in their exile they found a truth that could never have been revealed within the comfort of conformity. This is why returning borrowed shame is not simply an act of defiance. It is a sacred right. It is to step into exile willingly, to refuse the seduction of false belonging, and to face the terror of solitude. It is there, in the wilderness of the psyche, that the symbols of healing appear, dreams of rivers, of cleansing fires, of doors opening in darkened rooms. These are not mere fantasies. They are the psyche's way of showing that release is possible, that what was borrowed can be given back, that the self waits behind the veil of shame. I recall the dream of a man tormented by a sense of failure. In the dream, he was carrying a heavy cross through a deserted city. The people watched from windows, whispering. At last he collapsed, and a stranger approached him, saying, "This cross was carved for another, not for you." The man awoke weeping. His entire life had been spent carrying his father's disappointment, believing it to be his own. That night, through the symbolic drama, his psyche revealed the truth. He was bearing borrowed shame. From that day forward, he began to live differently. He put down the false cross, and his shoulders were free. But let us not romanticize too quickly. Returning borrowed shame does not erase the scars it left. The psyche remembers exile, and sometimes the wound remains tender even after the burden is lifted. One may still feel the echoes of humiliation, the reflex to shrink under imagined gazes, the fear of exposure. Healing is not the eradication of the past, but the integration of its meaning. What once poisoned can become wisdom if held with awareness. To say, "This shame was never mine," is the beginning of liberation. To add, "But it taught me to see where others suffer in silence," is to transmute exile into compassion. And so the work is twofold: to return the borrowed burden and to integrate the gift hidden within it. For shame, even when false, shapes the soul. It carves depths where light may later dwell. Those who have known exile can perceive the invisible chains on others. They can sense the quiet despair in a voice, the trembling in a posture, the unspoken sorrow in a dream. Their empathy is born not of sentimentality, but of survival. They have lived under borrowed weight and emerged with eyes that see what the world prefers to hide. Yet there is a danger here. Some, having returned the shame, grow bitter. They see only the injustice and they harden into resentment. They refuse the gift, clinging instead to the memory of wounds. In doing so, they remain bound, though in a different form. True liberation requires not only returning the borrowed burden, but also forgiving the ignorance that imposed it. Forgiveness does not mean excusing, it means ceasing. To carry, it means saying, "I will not let your blindness dictate my being." Without this act, the soul remains chained to the past, even if the shame itself has been laid down. Therefore, to return borrowed shame is an act of both courage and grace. It is to face the loneliness of exile and the risk of misunderstanding. It is to walk into the wilderness with no guarantee of welcome. But it is also to encounter the self in its naked truth. And when the self emerges, the exile is no longer mere outcast. He becomes pilgrim, prophet, healer. His very presence becomes a reminder that shame need not define identity, that burdens can be returned, that freedom is possible. Even now, perhaps you feel within yourself the tension between loyalty to the tribe and loyalty to the self. The tribe demands silence, conformity, complicity. The self demands authenticity. In truth, release. To choose the self is to betray the tribe, but to betray the self is to betray life itself. This is the crossroads where individuation always leads, to decide whose voice you will obey. If you choose to return the borrowed shame, you may lose the approval of others, but you will gain your soul. And let us not forget that the archetype of return is as ancient as exile. Just as myths speak of banishment, they also speak of homecoming. Odysseus returns from wandering. The prodigal son returns from squandering. The exile returns from captivity. So too does the soul, once freed from borrowed shame, return not to the tribe's illusions, but to the deeper homeland of the self. This home is not given by society, but discovered within. It is the eternal ground of being, where you are neither condemned nor approved, but simply are. So I ask you, what burdens have you carried that were never yours? Whose gaze still burns upon your skin? Whose voice still echoes in your conscience? Dare to trace them to their origin. Dare to say, "This does not belong to me." Dare to return what was never yours. For only then can you stand unclothed yet unashamed, naked yet whole, exiled yet at home. To speak of release is to speak of death and rebirth. For the psyche does not relinquish its burdens without passing through transformation. The return of borrowed shame is not a casual gesture, like setting down a bag you no longer need. It is more akin to dying to an identity that has clung to you like a second skin. The shame may have whispered in your conscience since childhood. It may have wrapped itself so tightly around your sense of self that you cannot imagine life without it. To return it is to undergo a symbolic death, to step into the void where an old self dissolves and a new one is yet unformed. This is why the unconscious often dramatizes the release of shame through images of death in dreams. One may dream of burying a corpse, of watching a house collapse, of shedding old clothes that disintegrate into dust. These are not omens of physical death, but symbolic enactments of psychic transformation. The corpse is a false identity, the house is the borrowed burden, the clothes are the inherited judgments. To see them fall away is to witness the soul preparing for rebirth, but death alone is not enough. After the letting go, the psyche longs for rebirth, for the vision of what lies beyond shame. This is why dreams of water, of light, of children being born often follow the darker images. The psyche seeks to reassure when the false is surrendered, the true emerges. When borrowed shame is returned, authentic dignity is born. This is not the fragile dignity that depends on others' approval, but the indestructible dignity that comes from union with the self. The self is not interested in your borrowed burdens. It is the image of wholeness, untouched by the projections of history. To encounter the self is to stand naked yet unashamed. For the self does not condemn, it does not measure worth by conformity or by the judgments of others. It is the eternal witness, the center of being, the source from which all archetypes arise and to which they return. When you release what is not yours, you step into the circle of the self, and there you discover that shame was never essential to your existence. Yet this rebirth often frightens the ego, for the ego has long defined itself by borrowed burdens. The ego says, "Who am I without this shame? Who am I if I am no longer the guilty child, the unworthy one, the outcast?" The ego resists the void, preferring the familiar prison of false identity. This is why many cling to their borrowed shame even after recognizing it as such. They prefer bondage to the terror of freedom. To move through this threshold, one must cultivate trust in the psyche's deeper wisdom. You must be willing to lose yourself, to fall into the unknown, to endure the silence between death and rebirth. This is the initiation of individuation, the trial through which the soul proves its courage. No analyst, no teacher, no friend can walk this passage for you. They may accompany you to the edge, but the crossing is yours alone. And yet, paradoxically, you are not alone. For the archetypes have walked this path countless times, and their symbols rise to meet you in the darkness. Consider the archetype of the phoenix. Consumed in fire, it is, and from its ashes, it is reborn. This ancient image belongs not to any one culture, but to the collective unconscious itself. It is the psyche's reminder that destruction is not the end, but the prelude to renewal. When you burn away borrowed shame, you enact the drama of the phoenix. From the ashes of false identity, the self arises, radiant. I remember a patient who dreamed of standing before a mirror, only to see the reflection of a stranger. She smashed the glass in terror. But behind it was another mirror, and behind that, another. At last, she reached the final mirror, and there was no reflection at all, only light. This dream was her psyche's revelation, beneath the layers of borrowed identity, beneath the reflections of others' judgments. There is no shame, no condemnation, only light. The dream freed her, not instantly, but gradually, as she allowed its truth to seep into her waking life. This is what it means to return borrowed shame. It is not merely to hand it back to those who imposed it, though sometimes that act is necessary. It is to recognize that at the deepest level, the shame never adhered to your essence. It was a costume, a reflection, a burden passed from hand to hand. When you release it, you do not diminish yourself, you reveal yourself. You stand in your own nakedness, not as Adam after the fall, but as Adam before the fall, in the innocence of being. And yet, innocence does not mean ignorance. To be reborn after exile is to know both sides, the weight of shame and the freedom beyond it. This is why those who have returned borrowed shame often radiate a strange authority. They are not naive, nor are they bitter. They are tempered like iron in fire. They have walked through exile, endured death, and emerged with a wisdom that cannot be taken. They carry no borrowed burden, yet they carry the memory of having been bound. That memory becomes compassion, discernment, and strength. The world desperately needs such individuals, for society thrives on projection, on scapegoating, on borrowing shame from the vulnerable to maintain its illusions. Only those who have broken the cycle can stand as witnesses to another way. They remind us that dignity is not given by the collective, but discovered in the self. They embody the possibility of freedom, and in their presence, others begin to question their own chains. So I say to you now, as if we were gathered in the living hall, eye to eye, soul to soul, it is time to return what was never yours. Take a deep breath and feel the weight you have carried. Feel the voices that whisper condemnation. Trace them back not to your authentic actions, not to your true conscience, but to the shadows of others, to the projections of history, to the fears of those who could not face their own darkness. See them for what they are, borrowed burdens, alien stones, garments that do not fit your skin, and then, in the silence of your inner vision, lay them down, return them to the earth, to the ancestors, to the collective, unconscious. Let them dissolve into the great river of time where they belong. And when you do, stand still. Do not rush to cover yourself with new garments, new borrowed identities. Stand in the rawness of your being. Feel the fear, the trembling, the exposure, and then notice beneath it all a stillness, a light, a dignity that cannot be touched. That is the self. That is your truth. That is who you are, beyond shame. Borrowed shame is an exile, but returning it is a homecoming. It is the end of false loyalty, the end of silent bondage, the end of living another's wound. It is the beginning of authenticity, of compassion, of freedom. And though the world may not understand, though it may accuse you of arrogance or betrayal, You will know within yourself the deeper truth. You are no longer carrying what was never yours. You are free, and in that freedom, you are not only healed, you become a healing presence. For every soul that dares to return, borrowed shame lightens the collective weight. Every individual who stands unashamed becomes a beacon for others still bound. The exile becomes the guide. The scapegoat becomes the prophet. The wounded one becomes the healer. This is the alchemy of the soul. This is the gift hidden in the burden. This is the eternal promise of individuation. So let us end here where we began, with the image of the house of the psyche. You have walked through its chambers, discovered rooms cluttered with burdens, not your own. You have carried them long enough. Now open the windows, let in the light, and return the borrowed relics to the earth. Walk through the house, unburdened, room by room, until you reach the central chamber where the self dwells. There, at the heart of your being, there is no shame, no condemnation, only the eternal truth. You are whole.